Russians and Ukrainians are a single nation. Both Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are the heirs of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes in a vast expanse from Ladoga, Novgorod, Pskov to Kiev and Chernihiv were united by one language. During the protracted war between the Russian state and the Commonwealth, some of the hetmans, the heirs of Khmelnytsky, either departed from Moscow or sought support from Sweden, Poland and Turkey. I repeat, the war was in fact a liberation character for the people. The name Ukraine was then used more often in the sense in which the old Russian word outskirts.
It
was a political signal. Moreover, it should be considered as military diplomatic pressure of Russia. This is certain signpost, countdown of military aggression.
Modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. We know and remember that to a large extent it was formed at the expense of historical Russia. But in 1991, all these territories and most importantly the people who lived there suddenly ended up abroad. And they were really cut off from their historical homeland. Inevitably, the time has come when the concept Ukraine is not Russia no longer suits. The anti-Russia was required, which we will never put up with.
In addition to Putin's article, there was Sukov's article about Russian position, that this country cannot be focused on internal problems, since this would mean the collapse of the political regime. Well, he almost directly admitted this, and in order not to focus on for himself to prevent collapse, he needs to start the war. According to him, there is no Ukrainian people. He said that Ukrainianness is a myth, and they will change the history. Ukraine might exist, but definitely not within its current borders. That is being one of the Putin's main ideologies. He worked out certain solutions for him, and it is clear that this was also a signal.
Україна, можливо, буде існувати, але точно не в нинішніх кордонах, як він тоді писав. Тобто, з цієї точки зору, враховуючи, що Сурков, він свій час працював одним із головних ідеологів Путіна, він напрацьовував йому певні рішення, ясна річ, що це теж було сигналом.
Please vote. 274. The decision has been made. I congratulate Denys Anatolyevich on his election to the post.
Before Denys said he would rather be a candidate, Denys Monastyrskyi had a very big experience. He was very worried. I often saw people who were appointed to such positions. These people often had euphoria, and he didn't have it. He had a sense of great responsibility. Denys Monastyrskyi comments how President Volodymyr Zelenskyy proposed him to head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
I made the most difficult decision in my life to answer yes to the President's proposal to head the Ministry of the Interior. This happened a few minutes ago. I understand what a sacrifice I am making as a person, as a politician, but actually I made this choice.
Once he joked with a smile, "Can't we rename the ministry?" He dreamed to change the name into the Ministry of Security. He even constantly said without renaming that this is the Ministry of your Security, and it became so de facto. Now the National Police, the National Guard and Border Guards, these are absolutely military bodies which are active at war with the armed forces of Ukraine. Speech of newly appointed Minister of Internal Affairs Denys Monastyrskyi in the Parliament.
I do not promise to solve all problems in the blink of an eye. This is impossible. But I promise to perform my work as a minister professionally and principledly. And I am ready to serve in the interests of the Ukrainian people and state.
It was an unprecedented event for us. Ample opportunities were envisaged for the creation of territorial defense and free territories in territories controlled by Ukraine. It was assumed that this territorial defense would actually be brought to the level of a branch of forces in the armed forces. That is, formally, it was a separate type of force, just like the air assault troops, like the ground forces. It's another branch in the military. This is territorial defense.
як десантно-штурмові.
The large numbers provided for terrorist defense, more than 100,000, is a lot for army, which total 260,000.
Безпрецедентно велика кількість передбачена для
That is half of our army was formed by troops of the territorial defense force.
армії, яка всього-навсього налічувала там загально там 260 тисяч. Тобто половина всієї нашої армії складали саме війська Сили територіальної оборони.
It means that the state was preparing unconditionally. We were preparing that such an invasion might take place and that the fighting might intensify. Valerii Zaluzhynyi, commander of the North Operational Command, is appointed to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Ми побачили, що
There were people who were responsible for the power unit. They made the right personnel appointments.
робили правильні ставки, правильні.
And here, not only the figure of Zaluzhny himself, all the leadership, all branches of the military received new commanders.
Всі роди сил
In
отримали.
order to raise a new army in Ukraine, this military elite of ours, which later became the skeleton and saved Ukraine, dozens of commanders who had invaluable experience, this is what the Western partners did not understand.
Десятки це дійсно бойових командирів, які мали безцінний досвід. От те, чого не розуміли наші західні
That the
партнери.
experience of participating in the war since the 2014 is much more than some Western experts, analysts.
Він важив набагато більше, ніж якісь авторитети чи якісь розмірковування, скажімо так.
And so on. An army with such experience had a much greater chance of holding out against the Russian Federation than an army with better equipment, large numbers, but not having such unique combat experience.
Навіть от армія з кращою технікою, з там більше по чисельності, але яка не мала такого бойового, унікального, дійсно бойового досвіду.
For me, it is a great honor for the first time as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine to speak to such a respected audience. The Armed Forces of Ukraine must develop. They must improve tactics, reevaluate the forms and methods of use, even in such conditions that we currently have in order to minimize losses. And most importantly, preparations for conducting offensive operation to liberate the occupied territories.
Призначення Залужного, мені здається, це
Zaluzhny's appointment is just a reaction. This is important. This is preparation for the rebuff and aggression for the fact that hostilities can revive. One of his first decisions was that he cancelled the impossibility of return fire on the demarcation line in the east. And accordingly, it became clear that hostilities were intensifying in the east.
стало помітно, що на сході активізуються бойові дії.
I congratulate all of us on this great and important day.
Великим і важливим днем. Сьогодні ми
Today we celebrate the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence.
річницю проголошення незалежності України.
Meaningful changes happened in state policy. Remember the speech of the president, those of his thesis when it was necessary to focus on the military component of the state in the previous year.
Акцентувати на мілітарній складовій
They
державі.
had already been completely radically changed under the threats that existed from the Russian Federation.
Загрозами, які існували від Російської Федерації.
And since August 24th, we all saw it was the big parade with our equipment, with foreign equipment,
З іноземною технікою і з запрошенням всіх дипломатичних представництв, тобто всі представництва всіх країн.
with the invitation of all diplomatic missions, that is, all the representations of all countries were in Independence Square in Kyiv.
В центрі Києва.
The country that is not afraid of the word for the first time.
Слова вперше. А тому вперше за 30 років Антонов будує для держави 3 літаки.
And therefore, for this time in 30 years, Antonov plant is building 3 aircraft for the state. Helicopters on Ukrainian blades are being built for the army, and the new tanks are being built this year. A strong country revives the navy, naval bases, and builds corvettes.
Флот, воєнно-морські бази і будує корвети.
Це була демонстрація від президента, що це моя країна.
It was a demonstration from the president that this is his country, this is our weapon. We will fight with this weapon. Let our Western partner, Western allies see our strength. Let the whole world see. That is, Ukraine demonstrated its intentions to the event.
США виходить з Афганістану, і там
When the United States left Afghanistan, we saw the real picture of the country. Remember the unfortunate Afghans grabbed the landing gear of the plane.
боролися за шасі літака, пам'ятаєте, і це все ще
That's all that happened there at the airport.
і потім стрімкий наступ талібів.
And then the Taliban. In a few days, the loss of the Afghan government army in which the United States have invested
Сполучені Штати роками вкладали гроші.
money, force, resources for training, education for years. A few weeks later, Afghanistan was almost completely captured by the Taliban, who were less armed and less equipped, etc.
Менш оснащені і так далі.
Те, що відбулося в Афганістані, це було
What happened in Afghanistan was a shock to the United States, because as the troops were leaving from there, it was a completely unpleasant thing for them, because they were counting on a different scenario.
на трошки інший варіант розвитку подій.
An additional incentive to resort to hostilities and not to intimidation there or show force provoked the Americans' retreat from Afghanistan.
Провокував відступ американців з Афганістану.
The way this happened portrayed Americans in Putin's eyes as weak, not ready for serious actions, and so on.
Зобразило в очах Путіна американців слабкими, тобто не готовими до серйозних там дій.
Look how weak they were, how shamefully they fled from Afghanistan. And this spurred him on to make a decision in favor of hostilities.
До того, щоб ухвалити рішення на користь бойових дій.
Посилювалися вже загрози.
The already menacing tendencies on our eastern borders were intensifying. Russia was amassing troops.
Війська. Перші партії зброї, і це якраз зброя саме для піхоти, тобто це є
The first batches of weapons, portable anti-tank missile systems, then anti-aircraft, then anti-helicopters.
проти гелікоптерів.
Бо у світі
Nobody in the world feels safe anymore. I emphasize, no one feels safe
ніхто не почуває себе у безпеці.
and can't hide behind international law like behind a stone wall.
Стіною.
Ну, звичайно.
Well, of course, it was a sign. It was a kind of preparation. They gave Javelin. Remember how much criticism there was that this was not the right weapon, how many anti-tank weapons needed, but it was needed.
А вона була потрібна. Вона зіграла важливу роль, коли рух
It played an important role when tank columns were on the territory of Ukraine and when they were stopped and burned. These tanks were destroyed by our fighters and our defense forces. This demonstrated that it was a weapon. At that stage, it was really needed and it played an important role.
важливу роль.
На пострадянському просторі найбільш
In the post-Soviet space, the most famous example is with Stalin, when he rejected the information that there would be an attack on the Soviet Union on June 22nd.
Радянський Союз така інформація.
Such information was from various sources.
І для нього напад став
He didn't perceive it,
для українського керівництва.
and for him, the attack came as a shock.
Ну і по США теж
For the Ukrainian leadership, the attack didn't come as shock.
конспірологи сперечаються.
As for United States, there is also an example. Until now, conspiracy theorists are arguing, blaming perhaps the greatest President Roosevelt for ignoring information about the exact date and exact time of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Навіть час нападу на Перл-Харбор. От там приклади. Не завжди навіть політичні лідери своїх країн
Not always even the world leaders of their countries believe their intelligence information about the attack.
У нас такої ситуації не було. Для
We
України
didn't have such situation. For Ukraine, the risk of an offensive was not a secret.
тут була інша проблема.
There was another problem. Publicly, the Ukrainian leadership didn't want to disperse the panic, because panic usually works in favor of the aggressor.
Користь агресору.
той візит був пов'язаний з тим, щоб
That visit was connected with testing the waters first and try to find out what Russia is actually planning, but most likely they already had certain data, but of a close nature, that the idea of large-scale war and invasion is being seriously discussed between the Russian leadership.
серйозно обговорюється в російському керівництві.
Ставлю на голосування пропозицію про призначення.
Vote on the appointment of Reznikov as Minister of Defense of Ukraine.
Прошу народних депутатів голосувати.
273. The decision is made.
Я, Резніков Олексій Юрійович, усвідомлюючи високу відповідальність
I, Oleksii Reznikov, solemnly swear allegiance to the Ukrainian people.
на вірність українському народові.
Це вже абсолютно новий погляд.
This is a completely new understanding of the Ministry of Defense. Western standards provide for the separation of the civilian and military components. That is, the Minister of Defense in NATO countries must be a civilian citizen.
Є обов'язково, повинен бути обов'язково.
Because the ministry is just management. It's about how to get money, how to distribute it, how to effectively manage military spending. But the military should not be involved in politics and administration because they should be busy with the war.
А от військові не повинні бути дотичними до політики, до адміністрування, тому що вони повинні...
We have always had this old Soviet system when already retired military men who, due to some age status or something like that, simply went into politics and, in fact, they remained the same military men, but now in a suit and a tie.
Входили в політику, і, по суті, вони залишалися тими самими військовими, але вже тепер в піджаку і з краваткою.
It was the first time in 30 years that we have separated very radically these two areas, military and civilian management.
Військові і цивільний менеджмент.
Ви чули сьогодні і питання про
We
арсенал.
heard today about the arsenal, warehouses, unfinished housing and military camps.
Наступна
The next story is about human issues.
головна річ, яка буде зроблена, ми з паном Валерієм Федоровичем
Most importantly, what will be done. Mr. Zaluzhny and I will organize work between the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense.
скажімо так, існуюча сьогодні певна конкуренція, вона буде...
The armed forces of Ukraine protect us, and my task is to protect them.
Моя задача захищати їх.
This is a strengthening of the power vertical. It was about all the power structures without exception. That is the thesis which is thrown into Ukrainian society that the government was not prepared, or let's say was not ready, and accordingly the military invasion took us by surprise is completely untrue. These personnel appointments indicate that the managerial vertical has been strengthened.
Russia has deployed a large military force in regions close to Ukraine's state border. This includes tanks, artillery, electronic warfare systems, air and naval forces. There are over 40 battalion tactical groups.
Тут треба
We
розуміти
must understand one fundamental difference.
з інших країн. Якщо ми беремо країни НАТО,
Russia from other countries. If we accept NATO countries, then they can have 20,000 troops to participate in the trainings, but if we look at the amount of equipment that is taking, then it will be huge. In Russia, as a rule, everything happens the other way. They have a huge amount of manpower.
ну і там набагато менша кількість техніки. Да, вона не маленька, оскільки все одно
And there is a much small amount of equipment. It's not small, of course. It was perceived as a certain attempt to demonstrate the power of the army in order to scare, to force the president to run to meet with Putin, ask for negotiations, make some concessions, and so on.
перемовини, йти на якісь там поступки і так далі.
8 років триває
The war in Donbas has been lasting for 8 years. 8 years since Russia annexed Crimea.
боюся говорити всім і говорити
And I am not afraid to speak to everyone and speak directly to Russians.
з ним. Не ми
We are not afraid of direct dialogue. The whole world supports us. But no one except our army will protect us. It's right. We must confess that without our army, we cannot stop the war.
Ми зможемо зупинити війну.
Наша розвідка
Our intelligence analyzes all scenarios, including the worst ones. A large-scale escalation from Russia exists. The most likely time to be ready for the escalation will be the end of January.
кінець січня.
Reznikov's statement refutes the report that the authorities were not informed. Ukrainian intelligence is not only a security service, but also the main intelligence directorate possessed information about the deployment of a contingent. At the borders, and accordingly, the statement indicated that we planned to counteract aggression.
Oleksii Reznikov in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine is interested in the political and diplomatic scenario of regulation. In principle, there can be no forceful provocations on our part. At the same time, the way to appease the aggressor is not considered. If necessary, Ukraine will fight back.
I think that someone from the high-ranking leadership of Russia leaked this information. And on the one hand, I think that the American intelligence services, for various reasons, could have different motives.
Там могли бути різні мотиви. Або там він хотів зайняти місце Путіна, або
Or to take Putin's place there, or, let's say, get from the Americans in the future some preferences when the government changes in Russia.
інших причин, але інформація виходила назовні.
We need to start from the moment when Biden became president. There was an important episode when Biden called Putin a murderer.
І мав місце дуже такий важливий епізод. Це коли Байден назвав Путіна вбивцею.
You know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer? Mm-hmm. I do. So what price must he pay? The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see.
Байден йому подзвонив.
Biden called him a murderer. Thus, Biden repented before the Russians. As part of his phrase,
Фактично, таким чином, нібито Байден
Putin massively built up troops on our border. It was April-May 2021.
подавала. В рамках десь цієї фрази Путін
It's a massive build-up where risk of intrusion was, and there was a de-escalation later.
травень 21-го року. Це от масштабне нарощення, да? Тобто коли ми вже теж говорили, що є ризик вторгнення, і пізніше нібито відбулася якась деескалація.
There was no de-escalation, in fact. Putin didn't withdraw troops.
Не відводив ніяких військ.
Це закінчення саме
This was the end of the cycle West-Putin relations. He saw the Western leaders could not oppose him.
лідери не можуть йому нічого протиставити.
They noted that Putin had decided to liquidate the top leadership of our country. Putin decided to create filtration camps.
Путін прийняв рішення про створення концтабору.
And we have absolutely no chance.
Шансів у нас майже немає від слова зовсім. А
He
якщо
explained to us that we will not be able to have any resistance at all if Putin decides to go on such an attack.
супротив, якщо Путін прийме рішення перед
I told that they just don't know us.
ви просто нас не знаєте.
Історично
Putin said that, firstly, there will be no more Ukraine.
сказав, що, по-перше, України більше не буде.
Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries will be all Russia, Moldova, of course. NATO should get out of the limits that were defined in 1945.
Забирайтеся до меж, які
In fact, Eastern Europe must again be given over, as after 1945, to this new
про те, що уся Східна Європа повинна бути знову, як після 45-го року,
reincarnation of the Soviet Union, which is now called Putin's Russia.
Радянського Союзу, яка тепер називається Путінська Росія.
Росія ультимативно вимагає
Russia demanded to accept its right to violate international law, to enter any country, territory, and do whatever it wants.
в будь-яку країну на територію, робити там все, що
Moreover, they called it security guarantees.
безпеки для себе.
Сам цей ультиматум
This ultimatum was meaningless in its essence. Putin knew perfectly well that NATO could not give him a positive answer.
може дати йому позитивну відповідь. Цей ультиматум це був казус беллі.
That is, he was looking for a reason to start the war.
Тобто не можна вимагати від організацій-членів
It
НАТО
is impossible to demand from NATO members to violate the charter in order to please Putin. And it was clear that the answer would be, it is impossible.
буде така, що ні, тобто це неможливо.
Та власне були так звані
There were so-called red lines. Putin made it clear, first of all, to the NATO countries about the possibility of further scenarios, namely military interventions, a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. The reaction of NATO NATO countries was confusion. Everyone predicted Ukraine no more than a week.
Мені шкода.
I feel sorry for the French president.
Не знаю, чи я би витримав 3 години історичного екскурсу від
I don't know if I endured 3 hours of historical excursion from Putin.
Там мінські домовленості і так далі. Він слухав про історичний аспект.
He did not listen about the Minsk agreements. In fact, he listened to the historical aspects of how Russia developed.
І так далі, і так далі.
Macron acted as an intermediary.
Посередником
In the best traditions of shuttle diplomacy, which was once supported by Henry Kissinger.
був Генрі Кіссінджер, який зараз багато також коментує, що відбувається.
Macron's visit had several reasons. On the one hand, he had some relations with the Russian leader.
З якимись там позиціями узгоджувати, летіти.
They talked, called up, and Macron perhaps had some illusions that he could change the situation.
Були більш-менш якісь там відносини.
Maybe Macron hoped he would be able to intercept Merkel's ranks.
Вони там зізвонювалися. І у Макрона, можливо,
But after that visit in early February,
сидити за стіл перемовин. Може, Макрон сподівався, що він зможе якби перехопити лаври.
he already realized that he would no longer stop what had begun.
Лютого, ну він же, мабуть, зрозумів, що він не зупинить те, що почалося.
Немає, скажімо, кращого приводу.
There is no better reason to prepare for an invasion than to do it under the cover of exercises, as Russia did. Of course, they made public statements that there will be no war, and they lied traditionally.
Що війни не буде, там, брехали традиційно.
According to the world society, February 16th will be the day of the attack.
Ми зробимо його.
We will make the Unity Day. The corresponding decree has already been signed.
Підписав. Цього дня ми вивісимо.
On this day, we will hang our national flags, put on blue and yellow ribbons, and show our unity to the whole world.
Єдність.
Військові навчання це
Military exercises are always cause for concern.
командувач
The commander of the ground forces, Colonel General Syrskyi, gave instructions to prepare.
віддав певні розпорядження.
A few days before the war, Kiev was divided into defense sectors. Their commanders were appointed.
Київ було поділено на сектори оборони.
And it worked very well when the full-scale invasion
Це
started.
дуже потужно спрацювало, коли почалася безпосередня агресія.
По-перше, ми дуже потужно.
First of all, we started to work with the fifth column.
Ми починали працювати з агентами впливу, які
We started working against agents of influence in our country.
оселилися ще починаючи з часів Кучми. Вони пішли
They settled here since the time of Kuchma. They went into the political process.
на кума Путіна, Медведчука і найближче його оточення. Для багатьох це був шок.
And a lot of other things were done to prepare the society.
Було зроблено для того, щоб суспільство підготувалося.
Була перевірка у них ще цих.
It was a nuclear readiness test. It was a signal to the West. They are already pumping their own population. Here we are incredibly powerful.
Ну, тобто, і все інше. Тобто вони вже просто про плюс прокачка свого населення, прокачка своїх, що ми ось тут, які ми тут неймовірно...
He, Putin, also presented various missiles there before that 6 month. His developments, how can he destroy the United States?
Свої розробки, як він там Штати може знищити і все інше.
За відмову
For the rejection of the third nuclear potential in the world, Ukraine received security guarantees.
безпеки. Тієї зброї у нас немає.
We don't have that weapon. We don't have security.
Нас немає також. Немає і частини територій нашої
The
держави.
lost territory of our state, which is larger than Switzerland, than Netherlands,
Бельгія. А головне, немає мільйонів
or
наших
Belgium. And most importantly, there are no millions of our Ukrainian citizens.
Немає. Отже, дещо є. Є право.
It is the right to demand a transition from policy of appeasement to guarantees of security and peace.
І миру.
Не було вже
There were no other arguments
якими можна було б достукатися.
than that could reach out to the West because the war was already on the threshold.
Реакція якраз в
Reaction of the Western partners was very emotional. We heard at that time they were applauding the president.
якраз президенту.
I was in Munich at that time. I remember the reaction very well.
Я дуже добре пам'ятаю реакцію.
It was one of the most resonant speeches of Zelenskyy during the pre-war period of his presidency. Tough, principled, and it caused a huge resonance.
Жорстка, принципова. Да, і це викликало величезний резонанс.
I remember how our people's deputies who were in Munich reacted.
Депутати, які були в Мюнхені, навіть критики президента.
Even critics of the president welcomed his speech.
Це дуже показово було, да.
Нам кажуть,
This also applies to NATO. The door is open, but for now, outsiders are not allowed.
якщо не всі члени альянсу хочуть нас бачити,
If not all members of the alliance want to see us, or if all members of the alliance do not want to see us, be honest.
двері це добре, але нам потрібні відкриті.
Tell it. An open door is good, but we need open answers, not years of unanswered questions.
Вже зараз
Already now there is evidence both from the Russian side and from Western sources that Putin made the decision to attack before 2021,
про напад на Україну Путін ухвалив ще в
long before Zelensky's speech. Therefore, referring to Zelensky's speech is looking for a reason, as if Ukraine provoked it. This is a common Russian strategy, but responsibility to the other side.
Традиційна російська стратегія перекладати відповідальність на іншу сторону.
By the way, situation like with Hitler when he started World War II, the attack on Poland, they provoked an attack by the Poles on the German border town, blamed the Poles, and this was the reason for the attack.
І це було приводом для нападу.
We can draw the parallels, analogies with the beginning of the invasion of Georgia.
З початком вторгнення в Грузію.
Putin needs some kind of huge world event under the guise of which he can carry out his aggression.
Подія, під прикриттям якої
There were Olympics in 2008.
свою варварську агресію. Йому була
Then he began aggression towards Georgia. Now the same event was taking place, but already in Beijing.
агресію стосовно Грузії. Тепер же
Of course, Putin could not start his aggression during the Olympics
але вже тепер в Пекіні. Звісно ж, Путін не міг.
because the leaders of China have much more influence, authority, including for Putin himself. The war could not overshadow the main event in China.
Мають набагато більший вплив, авторитет, в тому числі для самого Путіна, і не могла війна затьмарити
His calculation is simple. While the world is watching the Olympics, no one will take into account that Ukraine has fallen under the control of Russia in a few days.
Зважати на те, що якась там Україна сама по собі за кілька днів відійшла під контроль Росії.
Дуже схожа ситуація.
The same situation in 2014. Putin launched an operation to occupy Crimea at the end of the Sochi Olympics.
Після завершення Сочинської олімпіади.
На території
About 800,000 citizens of the Russian Federation currently live on the territory of these two unrecognized, the so-called LNR-DNR. I mean Vladimir Vladimirovich. Not even the Russian world, which we patronize, help support in every possible way, but the citizens of the Russian Federation.
On February 21st, when the infamous meeting of the Security Council of the Russian Federation took place,
Російського Радбезу, Ради безпеки
it even looked like an interrogation of individual members of the Security Council. Russian politicians, and each one demanded his personal specific position in recognizing the so-called LNR-DNR.
так званих ДНР, ЛНР.
Do you mean to start the negotiation process or recognize sovereignty?
I will support.
What do you mean?
Говорите прямо. Я поддержу предложение о признании. Поддержу или
I'm speaking about recognition or...
Так и скажите, да или нет?
Yes, I support the joining of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics into the Russian Federation.
И Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Speak directly, Sergei Evgenievich. I support, say yes or no. We don't talk about it. We don't discuss it. Are we talking about recognizing their independence or not?
Yes, I support the recognition of independence. Thank you.
On the one hand, it looked like a public interrogation for the whole country, and on the other hand, it looked like a bunch of bandits
Це виглядало як, знаєте, збіговиська бандитів.
When the main bandit demanded everyone to sign with blood, everyone must be linked.
Тобто всі мають бути пов'язані. Путіну потрібно було публічно продемонструвати, що всі мають погодитись.
Putin needed to demonstrate publicly that everyone should agree with his decision. It was a PR action, and then Putin's speech.
Це явно була така піар-акція, а потім виступ Путіна.
Modern Ukraine was created by Russia. Stalin annexed it to the USSR and gave some lands that belonged to Poland, Romania and Hungary. In 1954, Khrushchev for some reason took away Crimea from Russia and also gave it to Ukraine.
Зачем-то отобрал у России Крым и тоже подарил его Украине.
Actually, this is how the territory of Soviet Ukraine was formed.
Территория советской Украины.
Я от для себе тоді так це назвав.
It was an hour of hatred for Ukraine. It became clear that the war is inevitable.
Що все, війна неминуча.
Do you want decommunization? Well, that is good for us, but we are ready to show what real decommunization means for Ukraine. Are you giving up your own past? From the so-called colonial heritage of the Russian Empire, Ukraine's accession to NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security. In NATO documents, our country is officially declared the main threat to Euro-Atlantic security.
НАТО, наша страна, официально, прямо объявлена главной.
And Ukraine will serve as the springboard for such a strike.
И в качестве передового плацдарма для такого удара будет служить Украина.
Recognition of the LNR, DNR, according to the Russian version, is within the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. If, in accordance with the start of large-scale invasion, the Ukrainian side controlled approximately 70% of the territory of the Lugansk region, up to approximately 60% of the Donetsk region, then accordingly, when Putin made a statement, it became clear that this war is a direct military invasion in order to expand the territories controlled by the Russian Federation.
Считаю необходимым принять.
I consider it necessary to make a long overdue decision.
Незамедлительно признать независимость.
Immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. I ask the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then ratify the treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with both republics.
How did the population react? Very simple. Huge lines at the border since January 2022. When talks about mobilization began, 6 mobilization waves were carried out.
Вони готувалися в 2021 році за програмою бойовий армійський резервний состав БАРС. Така абревіатура.
They were trained in 2021 according to the BARS Army Reserve Program, the Shoigu project, which was used at the temporarily occupied territories.
Було таких кілька випадків, про які мені відомо. Це коли
In fact, I know some of such cases.
Це було 19-го, 20-го навіть. І просто озброєні окупанти.
In the morning, a bus with workers went to the route to the meat plant. It was February 19th, 20th, 2021. Armed occupiers simply cordoned off the bus and took everyone to the mobilization center.
1 лютого. Їх розвернули і під конвоєм відправили на збори.
I got the diary of a Russian officer who served in the Crimea, and he described that they already knew the war started. They were not told about it, but they were issued combat maps and were relocated to the border with Ukraine. A little bit later, we realized that hostilities were supposed to begin on the night of 21st. That is, in fact, on the 22nd. This is symbolic dependence on dates.
І в цьому ми можемо знову ж таки побачити якесь оце таке його...
Because on the 22nd at 5 a.m. the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union.
Числа в 5 ранку нацисти напали на Радянський Союз.
А далі вже там різні джерела кажуть там.
According to various sources, they planned on February 23rd and started 24th.
Свята радянської армії.
Because February 23rd is the day of the Soviet army.
Не хотіли, знаєте, плутати умовно парад з війною.
A traditional holiday for the Russian military, so they probably didn't want to mix the parade with the war.
Да, ну а наступати вже після. З похмілля воно, мабуть, краще було б.
On February 22nd, when I received a red folder in this office with threats to the life of our president at 1910, I understood that they would act in the near future.
Вони ж божевільні, вони ж вважали, що їх тут будуть.
They really believed that they would be greeted here in Ukraine with flowers. It's just total madness in Russia.
На Росії.